The Middle East Institute presents Aamir Rehman discussing Gulf capital and Islamic finance, the rise of new global players. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Kate Seeley with the Middle East Institute. And today we're very happy to have with us Aamir Rehman, who's a Middle East Institute scholar. Most institutes sort of talk about books or host book launches after they've been published, but we're going to do a sneak preview of a book that Aamir is publishing in December, being put out by McGraw-Hill, called Gulf Capital and Islamic Finance, The Rise of New Global Players. Today, the Gulf investors hold more than $1.4 trillion in assets, which has given them a new influence and clout in international markets, and we'll be hearing about that today. Just a little bit of background about Aamir. His first book, Dubai and Company, Global Strategies for Doing Business, also published by McGraw-Hill, was extremely well received when it was published in 2007. A reader on Amazon called it the most powerful guide you can have to start doing business in the Gulf. That's quite a plug. Aamir is a global corporate strategy expert who was formerly the global head of strategy for HSBC Amana, the world's third largest bank, and was a consultant with the Boston Consulting Group. He's currently an advisor to Fortune 500 and other leading businesses and helps develop strategies for multinationals across the globe. So Aamir knows what he's talking about. And now please join me in welcoming Aamir Rehman.
All right, Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala Rasulullah. Thank you so much for that introduction, Kate, and thanks for having me here. It's always a pleasure to be back here at the Middle East Institute. And for people who are involved in Middle East work, it's rare to find a community like this one, where you can see so many people who look at the region from different angles and different areas of expertise and different disciplines. So I've really enjoyed my time as a adjunct scholar here, and I think it's a very admirable organization and feel privileged to be here to speak, as Kate mentioned, for the first time about this upcoming book, which is entitled Gulf Capital and Islamic Finance, The Rise of New Global Players. So Kate gave you a bit of a background about myself. What I'm actually interested in knowing about before we get into the discussion is the audience we have here. How many of you are involved in finance or financial services? Okay, a few. And so are the rest of you sort of Middle East studies experts? Is that the idea? Good. No, that's good. So we can talk about it from a Middle East. I'm being reminded that I'm supposed to give a talk right now. All right, so that's great. So then I won't make it too technical on the business and finance side. And what I'll do is, we have 1 hour. Is that right? Okay. Okay. So I'll try to speak for about, say, 40 minutes, and then have a Q&A and discussion, because this is, as I mentioned, the first time I'm discussing this book in public, and would love to hear more feedback, comments, questions on what's most interesting to you. So the book, as you can see here, is Gulf Capital and Islamic Finance, The Rise of New Global Players. And the theme very much is around how these two phenomena, Gulf Capital and Islamic Finance, which, as we discussed, are quite distinct things. So one interesting question is, why combine them in a single book? And the reason for that is that there's a very strong relationship between the two. So Gulf Capital is growing. It's important, it's increasingly influential. And Islamic finance, which is also a very fast-growing sector within the financial services world, is very much linked to the prosperity of the Gulf. And although it is certainly a global phenomenon that extends well beyond the Gulf, the relationship between the two is quite important to understand. So that's why they've been combined in a single work. And just to give you a sort of snapshot of what the book looks at, so we start by talking about the background and context of the Gulf investors, the sources of prosperity, the landscape. Sort of, we do a segmentation to help categorize the Gulf investors, and kind of make some sense of the various institutions that you see in the news. Then the discussion of Islamic finance begins, and it's interwoven between Islamic finance and Gulf capital. The next section of the book talks about developments and trends in Gulf capital, in terms of what are the big changes, how is Gulf capital behaving differently today than it has historically. And in a nutshell, the Gulf has been investing abroad for a very long time, or certainly for a generation or so. So since the 70s, there's been that investment following the first oil booms. But the characteristics of the nature of the investment has been evolving. And much of what we see today that we think as sort of new phenomenon or kind of unique and unprecedented investments actually are rooted in a long legacy of Gulf investment in this part of the world and elsewhere. So it's important to see what the trends are. And what we talk about in the book are the increased sophistication of Gulf investors. So one of the major trends is that Gulf capital is getting more sophisticated. So whereas it was historically has been very simple, plain vanilla types of investments, there's more diversification towards alternative investments, equity investments, and the like. Another trend is on domestic and regional investment, which is something I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But a relatively small proportion of Gulf surpluses are fed back now to the region and investing in the Gulf itself and investing in the broader Middle East. And that has had a very important effect on that part of the world. There's also a key trend towards emerging market investments. So besides investing in their own markets and in the broader Middle East, the GCC is much more interested in investing in emerging markets than it has been historically. And that trend is having a big impact both on the Gulf and on the markets, especially in relatively small markets where Gulf investors can have a pretty big impact by deciding to enter that market. It's also interesting, in the biggest IPO in history was for a Chinese bank called the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China. And the two biggest investors in that IPO were GCC institutions. And that's just an example of that appetite for emerging markets. The next major trend is around the increased affinity for Islamic or Sharia compliant investments. And this is a major and important trend. If you compare today, does anybody have a sense of, roughly speaking, the asset size of the entire Islamic finance industry? Anybody know? Okay, well, if you have to, okay, this is an unfair question, but let's see if I'll put some numbers out, then you sort of guess. 100 billion, 750 billion, 3 trillion. Which of these? 100 billion, anybody? Okay, 750? Okay, 3 trillion? All right, so it's about 750. That's what the estimates say. About $750 billion are the assets of the Islamic finance sector. Now, the Gulf sovereign wealth funds they don't report their asset size. So we don't know, of course, officially how large their asset pool is. But the estimates, if you look at the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority alone, the published estimates around that sovereign wealth fund are that its assets are about anywhere between, say, 600 billion and 1 trillion. So the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority alone has more assets than the entire Islamic finance industry, which gives you a sense of the relative scale of these phenomena, and also gives you a sense of the transformative potential that you have if these institutions start investing in a Sharia-compliant way, what that will do for the Islamic finance and the Islamic investment industry. Next, I talk about the increased visibility and transparency around Gulf investments, and that's an important trend that people in the Gulf and people outside are very, very interested in. Then the next section, which is sort of the fun part of the book, are around the implications of what this means for global institutions, be they banks, investors, or operating companies. And so I talk about how to attract, or some strategies for attracting Gulf capital, so how firms that are looking to raise money can make themselves more appealing for Gulf investors. I talk about how Gulf investments are shaping the investment strategies of international investors, and this is a very important thing, particularly for those for the folks who are in finance. Do you work in private equity by any chance? You do? So if you work in private equity, then you've seen the involvement of Gulf investors in different levels of private equity investment. So whereas previously you expected to see Gulf investors acting only as limited partners, meaning investors in funds, now you find them directly investing into companies or portfolio companies, either alongside the fund or even independent from the fund. And that's changing the competitive dynamics of the private equity industry. So it's quite significant. And the last point is around Islamic finance as there's a section on the